The alarm never sounded. Callan Royce's eyes opened 3 minutes before 6, the way they had every morning since Lena died. No clock needed. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. He lay still in the gray light filtering through blinds that hung crooked on one side, listening to the house settle around him. The coffee maker in the kitchen would start automatically in 12 minutes. Barrett's door down the hall stayed closed. The boy slept hard, the kind of deep sleep Callan hadn't known in 6 years. He swung his legs out of bed and planted his feet on the cold hardwood. The chill helped. It always did. Standing required intention, and intention kept the other thoughts away. The ones that crept in during those first waking seconds when the brain hadn't quite caught up to reality yet. The ones where Lena still existed somewhere in another room, humming off-key while she searched for her other shoe. The bathroom mirror reflected a face he'd stopped examining closely. 35 looked older when you measured it in oil changes and mortgage payments instead of birthday candles. He ran water until it went lukewarm, splashed it against his skin, and reached for the razor. The routine mattered more than the result. Barrett's door creaked open while Callan was pulling on his work shirt. The boy appeared in the hallway wearing mismatched socks and a t-shirt with a faded superhero logo Callan couldn't identify anymore. 9 years old and already too tall for half his clothes. Growth happened in bursts that caught Callan off guard, moments when he'd look up from a transmission rebuild and realize his son had somehow aged a month in an afternoon. Barrett rubbed his eyes with the heel of one hand. The other clutched a spiral notebook with bent corners and a cover decorated in marker scribbles that might have been meant as camouflage patterns. Morning already, Callan glanced at the window where pale sunlight now cut through the blinds at a sharper angle. He nodded and gestured toward the kitchen. Barrett shuffled past without further protest, his sock-muffled footsteps barely audible on the stairs. The coffee maker had finished its work by the time they reached the kitchen. Callan poured himself a cup while Barrett climbed onto the stool at the counter and flipped open his notebook. The boy's breakfast preferences cycled through phases. Last month it had been toast with too much butter. This month he wanted cereal, but only the kind with the blue box and only enough milk to barely cover the bottom of the bowl. Callan set the cereal box on the counter without comment and retrieved the milk from the refrigerator. Barrett poured with concentration, tongue visible between his teeth as he measured the exact ratio of grain to liquid. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Callan had learned that the hard way through trial and error, and one memorable morning involving scrambled eggs that ended with both of them in tears. The notebook demanded Barrett's attention even while he ate. Callan recognized the handwriting now, the careful block letters Barrett had been practicing since 3rd grade started. Lists filled the margins. Drawings occupied the spaces between words. Most of it looked like the standard 9-year-old mix of dinosaurs and spaceships, but one sketch caught Callan's eye. A figure in what might have been a uniform, though the proportions were off. Another figure beside it, smaller, holding what looked like a leash. Barrett noticed him looking and flipped the page quickly. Callan let it go and drank his coffee. The clock above the sink read 6:43. School started at 8:15, but the bus came at 7:30, which meant shoes and backpack and the usual search for whatever homework paper had gone missing overnight. The routine had worn grooves into their mornings, made the time pass in predictable increments that required minimal thought. Barrett finished his cereal and carried the bowl to the sink without being asked. Small victories, all. Callan rinsed it and added it to the growing collection of dishes that would get dealt with tonight or maybe tomorrow, depending on how the day went at the garage. The backpack was where it always was, hanging on the hook by the door. Barrett's shoes were not where they were supposed to be, which meant the usual hunt. Callan found them under the couch, one still tied from yesterday. Barrett sat on the floor and wrestled them on while Callan checked the contents of the backpack. Lunch money in the front pocket. Permission slip for the field trip next week signed and folded. Math homework that looked complete, though Callan wasn't confident enough in his own arithmetic to verify the answers. The bus arrived at 7:28, early as usual. Barrett grabbed his backpack and started for the door, then paused and turned back. He didn't say anything, just stood there with one hand on the strap, and that look on his face that meant words were forming but hadn't quite made it out yet. Callan waited. "When's the next time we visit Uncle Nash?" The question landed like it always did, without warning, in the space between ordinary moments. Callan kept his face neutral and his voice steady. "Soon. Maybe this weekend if the weather holds." Barrett nodded, satisfied for now, and headed out. Callan watched through the window as the boy climbed the bus steps and disappeared into the interior. The bus pulled away, brake lights flashing red at the stop sign before it turned the corner and vanished. The house felt larger when Barrett was gone. Callan finished his coffee, standing at the sink, looking out at the backyard where grass grew too long because he kept postponing the mowing. The day stretched ahead with the weight of predictability. Unlock the garage at 8. Check the appointment book. Mrs. Henderson's Civic needed an oil change. The Ramirez truck was waiting for new brake pads. Someone had called yesterday about a transmission noise that probably meant expensive news. He rinsed his cup and placed it in the sink with the others. The drive to work took 11 minutes if he caught the lights right. He grabbed his keys from the hook beside Barrett's backpack hook and locked the door behind him. Royce's garage sat on a corner lot where industrial gave way to commercial in a gradual transition of brick buildings and cracked parking lots. Callan's father had opened it in 1987, back when this part of town still had factories running double shifts. Now the factories were storage units and artisan bakeries, but the garage remained. The sign out front needed repainting. Callan had been saying that for 3 years. He parked in the spot marked owner and unlocked the bay doors. The familiar smell hit him immediately, oil and metal and the particular sweetness of antifreeze. His tools hung on the pegboard where he'd left them, organized in a system that made sense only to him. The lift stood ready in the center bay, everything in its place, waiting. The coffee corner occupied the back section where his father had originally planned to put an office. Callan had never bothered with the office part. Instead, he'd installed a commercial coffee maker, added 4 mismatched tables with chairs that didn't match either, and put up a chalkboard menu that listed exactly 3 options: coffee, black tea, or water. People seemed to like it. They'd stop in while waiting for their cars, or sometimes just to sit for a while before heading to actual jobs in actual offices. The Mrs. Henderson appointment wasn't until 9. Callan used the extra time to prep the bay and double-check his inventory. The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of mechanical problems with mechanical solutions. Oil drained, filters replaced, brake pads measured and swapped. Each task had a beginning and an end, a clear progression from broken to fixed. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag when the bell above the door chimed. Not the bay entrance, the front one that led into the coffee area. Callan glanced at the clock. 11:15. Too late for the morning crowd, too early for lunch. He tossed the rag onto the workbench and headed toward the front, already forming the polite greeting he used for customers who wandered in looking for the Quickie Lube place 2 blocks down. The door between the garage and the coffee area stood propped open. He could see through to the tables, most of them empty at this hour. Except one. The woman sat at the corner table with her back partially to the wall, a position that gave her clear sight lines to both the front entrance and the door to the garage. Callan noticed that first the way her chair was angled just so. Military habits were hard to break. He knew that from Nash. She wore jeans and a dark canvas jacket despite the mild temperature outside. Her hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail that suggested utility over style. Late 20s or early 30s, hard to tell exactly. She wasn't looking at her phone like most people did when they sat alone. Instead, her attention stayed fixed on the room itself, scanning in a pattern that seemed casual but wasn't. Beside her chair, a German shepherd sat with the kind of stillness that came from extensive training. The dog wore a vest marked with patches Callan recognized even from across the room. Service animal, do not pet. The vest was clean but showed wear at the edges, the kind that came from use rather than neglect. The woman's right leg extended out from under the table at an angle that looked slightly off. It took Callan a moment to understand why. The prosthetic started just below her knee, visible where her jeans rode up slightly. She didn't try to hide it. The blade-style foot rested flat against the floor, the carbon fiber material catching the light from the window. Callan made himself move forward instead of staring. His boots made enough noise on the concrete floor that she had plenty of warning before he reached the counter. Her eyes tracked him the whole way. The dog's head turned to follow as well, though it remained seated. Morning. Coffee. The woman's gaze flicked to the chalkboard menu, then back to him. Her voice came out quieter than he expected. Black coffee would be good. Thank you. Callan moved behind the counter and grabbed one of the clean mugs from the rack. The coffee maker had been sitting for over an hour, which meant the brew was probably stronger than it should be. He filled the mug anyway and carried it over to her table. She accepted it with both hands, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic like she was checking the temperature. Anything else? She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. Her eyes moved past him to the pegboard visible through the open door to the garage where the tools hung in their designated spots. Actually, I saw your sign out front, the hiring sign. Callan followed her gaze, then looked back at her. He'd put that sign up 6 weeks ago and forgotten about it. The cafe side needed help during peak hours, someone who could pour coffee and wipe tables while he worked on cars. He'd interviewed 3 people. 2 never showed up for their trial shifts. The third lasted 4 days before deciding the early mornings didn't fit her lifestyle. You looking for work if you still need someone? Callan considered. The cafe wasn't complicated. Coffee, tea, water. Collect money, make change. Keep the tables clean. The woman met his eyes when she spoke, didn't fidget or oversell herself. The dog sat like a statue beside her chair, betraying no anxiety or aggression. Those were good signs. What kind of experience you have? Not in food service, if that's what you're asking. But I can follow instructions and show up on time. Honest, at least. Callan appreciated that more than he probably should. He was about to ask another question when movement outside the window caught his attention. 3 men in work clothes were approaching the front door. Regulars from the construction site down the street. They usually came in around 11:30 for coffee before heading to lunch. The bell chimed as they entered. Callan nodded a greeting and moved back behind the counter. The construction workers filled the small space with their voices already mid-conversation about some problem with a concrete pour. They ordered 3 coffees and stood at the counter to drink them, blocking Callan's view of the woman's table. When they finally left 15 minutes later, he realized she'd moved. Not left, but shifted tables. She now sat 2 tables closer to the counter, though still maintaining that same careful angle that let her watch both entrances. The dog had moved with her repositioning without any visible command. Callan grabbed the pot and walked over to top off her mug. She held it steady while he poured, her knuckles showing white where she gripped the handle. Those men, did they have a reservation for that table? Callan blinked. What? The table where I was sitting. When they came in, one of them looked at me like I was in his spot. They don't have a spot. All the tables are open seating. She absorbed this information with a small nod, but something in her expression suggested she didn't quite believe him. The dog shifted its weight, and Callan noticed how its eyes kept returning to her face, checking in the way trained service animals did. The front door opened again. This time it was the Ramirez family, all 4 of them. They'd dropped off their truck that morning for the brake work. Callan had told them to come back after lunch. They crowded into the small cafe area, the 2 kids immediately gravitating toward the window to look out at the street. Mr. Ramirez approached the counter while his wife herded the children away from bumping into tables. Callan grabbed the keys to their truck from the pegboard behind the register. All set. Brake pads or new rotors were still good, so I just resurfaced them. Should be quiet now. Mr. Ramirez pulled out his wallet and counted out bills while Callan wrote up the receipt. The whole transaction took less than 5 minutes. The family left in a cluster of motion and noise, the bell chiming behind them. When Callan turned back, the woman had moved tables again. This time she was 1 table further from where she'd started, pushed into the corner near the bathroom. Her coffee sat untouched on the surface in front of her. The dog had repositioned as well, now sitting between her chair and the main walkway through the cafe. Callan walked over slowly, giving her plenty of warning. Her shoulders tensed as he approached a subtle shift that probably went unnoticed by most people. You keep moving tables. She looked down at her coffee. The prosthetic leg was fully visible now, the blade foot planted at an angle that suggested she was ready to stand quickly if needed. I can leave if I'm in the way. You're not in the way. I'm just wondering why you keep moving. Her jaw worked for a moment before she spoke. People were looking at the tables I was sitting at. I thought maybe they needed the space. Callan glanced around the cafe. Besides the woman, it was empty. The next rush wouldn't come until after 1 o'clock when the lunch crowd filtered through. Nobody needs the space right now. You can sit wherever you want. She didn't look convinced. The dog made a soft sound, not quite a whine, but close. Her hand dropped immediately to rest on its head, fingers scratching behind one ear in a gesture that looked automatic. What's the dog's name? Jericho. That's different. She almost smiled. It seemed to fit. Callan found himself smiling back, though he wasn't entirely sure why. He gestured toward the chair across from her. Mind if I sit? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She glanced at the chair, then back at him, then down at Jericho. The dog hadn't moved, but its attention had shifted fully to Callan, now tracking him with an intensity that went beyond casual interest. It's your cafe. That's not what I asked. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Callan pulled out the chair and sat. Up close he could see more details. The faint scar along her jawline that disappeared into her hairline. The way her jacket sleeves were pushed up just enough to reveal forearms marked with the kind of lean muscle that came from functional strength rather than gym vanity. Her hands showed old calluses across the palms, the kind that developed from gripping things repeatedly hard. You never told me your name. Sloan. Sloan Merritt. Callan Royce. This is my place. She nodded like she'd already figured that part out. Her eyes moved past him to the garage area visible through the open door. The pegboard with its organized tools, the lift in the center bay, the calendar on the wall marked with appointment times in his handwriting. You do good work, I try to. Been at it long enough to know what I'm doing. How long is that learned from my dad? He opened this place in '87. I took over about 6 years ago. Sloane's attention sharpened slightly at that. What happened? 6 years ago. Callan felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever he had to explain in condensed form what had actually been months of complicated grief and logistical nightmare. My wife died. I had a kid to raise by myself. Dad was already thinking about retirement, so we just moved up the timeline. I'm sorry. The words came out flat, not cold exactly, but lacking the usual performative sympathy most people layered on. Callan found himself preferring it that way. What about you? What brings you to town? Sloane's fingers tightened slightly on her coffee mug. Just passing through. Saw the hiring sign and thought I'd ask. Passing through to where nowhere specific. That kind of answer usually meant running from something rather than running to something, but Callan had learned years ago that everyone carried weight they didn't talk about. He let it go and shifted topics. You served, didn't you? The question made her stiffen. Jericho's head came up, ears forward, reading the change in her body language. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice had lost what little warmth it had contained before. What makes you think that? The dog. The way you sit. The way you cleared the room when those construction guys came in. Sloane's hand had moved back to Jericho's head, fingers working through the fur in a repetitive pattern. I was in for a while. Got out a few years ago. What branch? Does it matter? Not really. Just making conversation. She didn't offer more information and Callan didn't push. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Outside, a car drove past. Inside, the refrigerator in the corner hummed through its cooling cycle. Sloane broke first. The job. Is it still available? Yeah. Hours are 6 to 2 on weekdays, 8 to noon on Saturdays, 30 hours a week. It's just coffee service, keeping tables clean, that kind of thing. Pay is $15 an hour. When would I start? Tomorrow if you want. Today, if you're ready now. She looked at him like she was trying to identify a trap she knew had to be there somewhere. You don't want references. Background check. Can you pour coffee without burning people? Yes. Can you show up on time? Yes. Then I don't care about the rest of it. Most people who walk through that door just want decent coffee and a place to sit for 20 minutes. You can handle that. Sloane's expression shifted through several configurations before settling on something that might have been cautious hope. I can handle that. Good. There's an apron behind the counter, red one. Coffee station is pretty self-explanatory. Sugar and cream are on the side table. I'll walk you through the register when it's not busy." She stood carefully, weight transferring through the prosthetic in a way that looked practiced but still required thought. Jericho rose immediately, staying close to her left side. Callan stood as well and gestured for her to follow him toward the counter. He was showing her where the clean mugs were stored when Jericho did something unexpected. The dog had been perfect up to that point, the model of controlled behavior. But now it moved away from Sloane's side and walked directly to Callan. Not aggressive, not playful. Just walked over and sat down directly in front of him, close enough that Callan could feel the warmth coming off its body. The dog stared at him. Not the casual glance of a friendly animal, but the focused intensity of a working dog that had identified something significant. Its ears were forward, body rigid with attention. Every part of Jericho's posture suggested it recognized something about Callan, knew something it couldn't communicate except through this absolute stillness. Sloane's voice cut through sharp and surprised. "Jericho, heel." The dog didn't move. It stayed locked on Callan, staring with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Callan's neck prickle. "Jericho, heel. Now." Still nothing. Callan stood very still, aware that sudden movement might trigger a response he couldn't predict. He'd been around working dogs before. Nash had brought them home sometimes during leave, let them decompress in a civilian environment for a few days. They'd been friendly enough once they understood you weren't a threat, but they'd also been capable of switching into work mode without warning, and when they did, they became something different. Sloane moved around the counter, approaching carefully. Her hand reached for Jericho's collar, but the dog remained focused on Callan. She looked genuinely rattled now, the careful composure cracking around the edges. "He never does this. I don't understand what he's—" She stopped mid-sentence. Callan followed her gaze and realized she was looking past him now toward the wall behind the counter. He turned to see what had caught her attention. The photo hung in a simple black frame positioned between the menu board and the pegboard of tools. Callan had put it there 3 years ago and stopped really seeing it after the first few months. It showed 2 men in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, squinting against harsh sunlight. Both wore the exhausted grins of people who'd finished something difficult. The man on the left was Callan, younger and leaner, before the gray had started threading through his hair. The man on the right was taller, broader through the shoulders, with the same basic bone structure, but refined through years of military conditioning. Below the photo, a small brass plate carried an inscription: Lieutenant Nash Royce, Navy SEAL, 1985 to 2019. When Callan turned back toward Sloane, her face had gone completely white. She'd backed up 2 steps, hand pressed against the counter like she needed the support. Jericho had finally stopped staring at Callan and was now pressed against Sloane's legs, the dog's training overridden by whatever distress it sensed in her. Sloane's mouth opened and closed twice before sound came out. Nash Royce. The words were barely a whisper. Callan felt something cold settle in his stomach, the kind of premonition that arrives just before everything familiar becomes strange. "That's my brother. Was my brother." Sloane took another step back. Her hand had moved to Jericho's head again, fingers digging into the fur hard enough that the dog made a small sound of protest. She was looking at the photo like it was showing her something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. "When did he die?" Callan's throat felt tight. 2019. September. Where? Afghanistan. Kandahar. Sloane made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Her prosthetic leg shifted, the blade foot scraping slightly against the floor. The hand on Jericho's head was shaking now, visible tremors running through her fingers. Callan moved around the counter slowly, the way he'd approach a spooked animal. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer. Her eyes had locked onto the photo again, specifically onto Nash's face. The color still hadn't returned to her cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice came out wrecked and rough. "I knew him. I knew your brother." The cafe seemed to contract around those words. Callan heard them clearly enough, understood their meaning, but couldn't make them fit with anything that made sense. Nash had been dead for almost 7 years. His friends had been fellow SEALs, people who'd served alongside him in units Callan barely understood. This woman was young enough that she couldn't have overlapped with Nash's service timeline by more than a few years at most. How did you know him? Sloane shook her head. The motion looked involuntary, like she was trying to deny something she knew was true. I can't do this. I need to leave. She turned toward the door. Jericho moved with her, positioning himself between her and Callan in a protective stance that suggested the dog had shifted fully into guard mode. Callan didn't try to stop her, didn't reach out or raise his voice. He just watched as she crossed the cafe in uneven strides that betrayed how rattled she was. Her hand was on the door handle when he finally spoke. Wait. The word came out softer than he intended, but it carried enough weight that Sloane paused. She didn't turn around, just stood there with her hand gripping the door handle hard enough that her knuckles showed white even from across the room. If you knew Nash, then I want to hear about it. Please. Sloane's shoulders rose and fell with a breath deep enough to be visible. She still didn't turn around. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet Callan had to strain to hear it. You don't want to hear it. Trust me. Try me. She did turn then slowly, like the movement cost her something. Her face had lost none of its pallor. If anything, she looked worse now, like standing still was taking more effort than walking away would have. Nash was my commanding officer for 6 months. Callan processed that. The timeline was tight but possible. Nash had done multiple rotations through Afghanistan. 6 months could have been any of them. What unit? She gave him a look that suggested she wasn't going to answer that question for reasons that probably involved classification and paperwork Callan had no clearance to see. He let it go. When early 2019. That would have been Nash's last deployment, the one he didn't come back from. Callan felt his pulse pick up slightly the way it always did when he got close to the edges of what had actually happened over there. The official report had been sparse on details. Enemy contact, casualties sustained, remains recovered. The words had described an event without actually explaining anything. Were you there? When he died? Sloane's hand dropped from the door handle. She swayed slightly, and for a moment Callan thought she might actually fall. Jericho pressed closer, providing physical support. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. Yes. The single word hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Callan couldn't begin to parse. He wanted to ask more questions, wanted to know everything about those final moments that the official reports had reduced to sanitized bureaucratic language. But Sloane looked like she was barely holding herself together, like one more question might shatter whatever control she was maintaining. He settled for something simpler. You should sit down. I should leave. You look like you're going to pass out. Sloane glanced toward the tables, then back at him. Her expression suggested she was running calculations, weighing options against probabilities he couldn't guess at. Finally, she nodded once and moved back toward the nearest table. She didn't sit at first, just stood beside the chair with one hand resting on its back. Callan went behind the counter and poured a fresh cup of coffee. Added sugar without asking, the way Nash used to take it when he needed the extra hit. He carried it over and set it on the table in front of her. Drink that. Then we can talk if you want. Or not talk. Either way. Sloane lowered herself into the chair with the careful control of someone managing pain. Jericho immediately positioned himself between her and the front door, maintaining his protective stance. She wrapped both hands around the mug but didn't drink. The silence stretched. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. The refrigerator cycled off, leaving only the ambient sounds of the building settling around them. Callan pulled out the chair across from her and sat, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. When Sloane finally spoke, she didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the coffee in front of her. I was combat support, medical evac coordination. Your brother's unit was extracting a high-value target from a compound outside Kandahar. Things went wrong. How wrong? Wrong enough that I lost this. She gestured toward her prosthetic leg. Wrong enough that Nash and 3 others didn't make it out. Callan's chest constricted. He'd known Nash had died during an operation. The details had been kept from him, classified, or just too brutal to share with civilian family. He'd built his own version of events from imagination and the fragments of information that leaked through. None of his versions had included a woman young enough to be sitting across from him now, carrying wounds that matched the ones his brother had died from. What happened? Sloane shook her head. I can't talk about the operation. Classification. Then talk about Nash. She looked up at him, then really looked, and Callan saw something in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror on bad mornings. Guilt. The kind that didn't fade with time, that burrowed in and made a home. He was a good officer, careful with his people. He made sure everyone knew the plan before we went in. Past tense. Present tense. The shift between them felt significant in ways Callan couldn't articulate. Did you know him well? Well enough. We ran 3 missions together before Kandahar. And Jericho? Where does he fit? Sloane's hand moved to the dog's head automatically. This wasn't his name then. He was designated K9-417. He was paired with Nash for the last 2 months of the deployment. Callan looked at the dog with new understanding. Jericho stared back with those same intense eyes that had locked onto Callan earlier. Military working dogs were trained to bond with their handlers, to protect and serve alongside them in conditions that would break most animals. If Jericho had been Nash's dog, why do you have him now? When a handler dies, the dog usually gets reassigned or retired. Jericho was too young to retire, but he couldn't seem to bond with a new handler after Nash. They tried 3 different people. He shut down with all of them, so they offered him to me since I'd worked alongside them. That was kind of them. Sloane's laugh came out bitter. Kind isn't the word I'd use, more like practical. I was getting medically discharged anyway. They figured if the dog wouldn't work, at least he could be a service animal for someone who needed one. And you needed one. Still do. She paused, then added quietly, Jericho keeps me grounded when things get loud inside my head. Callan understood that better than she probably realized. Barrett served a similar function for him, giving him a reason to get up every morning to maintain routines that would have dissolved otherwise. The difference was Barrett was his son, not his keeper. The front door chimed. Both Sloane and Callan looked up to see an older man entering, someone Callan recognized as a semi-regular who came in once or twice a week for coffee. The man nodded a greeting and headed toward the counter. Callan stood. Hold on. He poured the coffee and took payment, making small talk about the weather and the construction happening downtown. The entire interaction took less than 3 minutes. When he returned to the table, Sloane had positioned herself differently. Chair angled so she could see both the front door and the exit to the garage bays. Jericho had shifted as well, maintaining his position between her and potential threats. The old man settled at a table near the window with his newspaper. Callan sat back down across from Sloane and kept his voice low. Why did Jericho react to me like that? She'd been avoiding eye contact, but now her gaze came up to meet his. Dogs remember scent. You probably smell like Nash did. Same soap, same deodorant, something genetic. Jericho recognized it. The explanation made sense, but it also opened up questions Callan wasn't sure he wanted to ask. If the dog remembered Nash's scent well enough to recognize it in a brother 7 years later, what else did the dog remember? What had he seen that night outside Kandahar? Sloane must have followed his thoughts because she spoke before he could form the question. He was there when Nash died. He stayed with him until the medevac arrived. Did he suffer? The question came out before Callan could stop it. He saw Sloane flinch like he'd struck her. Her hands tightened around the coffee mug hard enough that he worried it might crack. He was unconscious. I made sure of that. The words suggested she'd been close enough to Nash at the end to make medical decisions. Callan tried to imagine it. His brother dying in some foreign compound, while this woman tried to save him, while explosions tore through whatever semblance of order they'd managed to maintain. Thank you for being there. Sloane's expression twisted into something painful. Don't thank me. I'm the reason he went back. What does that mean? It means I got hit first. I went down and he came back for me instead of continuing the extraction. If he'd kept moving forward, if he'd just left me... She stopped, jaw clenched tight. Jericho made a low sound and pressed harder against her leg. Callan saw her hand shaking where it rested on the table. He wouldn't have left you. That wasn't who Nash was. You didn't see it. You don't know. I know my brother. He would have gone back for any of his people. That's what made him a good officer." Sloane's eyes were bright now, wet with tears she refused to let fall. The cafe felt too small, suddenly the walls too close. The old man with his newspaper seemed oblivious to the conversation happening 10 feet away, absorbed in whatever stories the printed pages contained. Callan reached across the table, slowly giving Sloane time to pull back if she wanted. She didn't. His hand covered hers where it gripped the mug. Her skin was cold despite the hot coffee. "Whatever you think, you're responsible for whatever guilt you're carrying. Nash wouldn't want that. He made his choices. You made yours. That's how it works in combat, right? Everyone does what they think is right in the moment. You don't understand. Then help me understand." She pulled her hand back, wrapping both arms around herself like she was cold. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "There were 4 of us wounded when the compound got hit. Me, Nash, and 2 others. The medevac could only take 3 on the first lift. I was the worst hit, so they prioritized me. Nash stayed behind with the other 2 until the second bird could come. But the second bird got delayed. Enemy fire. By the time it arrived, Nash had bled out trying to keep the others alive." Callan absorbed this new information, fitting it into the gaps in the story he'd been carrying for 7 years. The official report hadn't mentioned any of this. Just casualties sustained, remains recovered. Nothing about triage decisions or delayed evacuations or officers bleeding out while waiting for help that came too late. The others survived. Yes. Then Nash succeeded. He kept them alive, at the cost of his own life. That was his choice to make. Sloane shook her head, tears finally breaking free and tracking down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away, just let them fall. "You're supposed to be angry. You're supposed to blame me. Why would I do that? Because I'm the reason your brother is dead, and I'm still here." The raw pain in her voice hit Callan like a physical blow. He'd spent years managing his own grief, learning to function around the hole Nash's death had left. But this was different. This was someone who'd been there, who'd seen it happen, who carried the weight of survival when others hadn't. "I don't blame you. Nash made his choice. You made yours. Neither of you did anything wrong." The front door chimed again. This time it was a group of 4, 2 women and 2 men in business casual, probably from one of the offices that had started moving into the renovated factory spaces. They approached the counter, talking among themselves, not noticing or not caring about the scene playing out at the back table. Callan stood reluctantly. "I need to take care of this. Don't leave. Don't." Sloane didn't respond, just sat there with tears still running down her face, and Jericho pressed against her legs. Callan moved to the counter and took orders, poured coffee, made change. The whole transaction took less than 5 minutes, but when he turned back around, Sloane's table was empty. The front door stood slightly ajar, showing the street beyond. Jericho was gone too. Callan quickly scanned the garage bays, hoping she'd gone that direction instead, but found nothing. She'd slipped out while his back was turned, disappeared as quietly as she'd arrived. He crossed to the table where she'd been sitting. The coffee mug was still there, mostly full, the surface showing the faint ripples of recent disturbance. Beside it, weighed down by the sugar dispenser, was a folded piece of paper. Callan picked it up and opened it. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the letters formed with military precision. "I'm sorry. I can't do this. Tell Barrett his uncle was a hero." He read it twice, trying to parse meaning from the limited words. Barrett. She knew about Barrett somehow. Nash must have talked about his nephew during those months they'd served together. Must have shown pictures or told stories during whatever downtime existed between missions. Callan folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. His chest felt tight again, the way it did when too many emotions tried to occupy the same space. Relief that he'd finally met someone who'd been with Nash at the end. Frustration that she'd left before he could ask more questions. Concern for a woman clearly carrying trauma that rivaled his own. The business casual group settled at their table. The old man turned another page of his newspaper. The normal rhythms of the cafe continued around Callan like nothing significant had happened. He looked at the photo on the wall, at Nash's sun-squinted smile, and the easy confidence that had always come so naturally to his older brother, 7 years dead and still causing ripples in the present, still connecting people across time and distance in ways Callan couldn't predict. The afternoon passed. More customers came and went. Callan worked on a brake job and an oil change, letting the familiar mechanical tasks occupy his hands while his mind worked through what Sloane had told him. By the time he locked up at 6, he'd almost convinced himself she wouldn't come back. Barrett was doing homework at the kitchen table when Callan got home. The boy looked up long enough to acknowledge his father's return, then bent back over his math worksheet. Callan started dinner spaghetti because it was easy, and Barrett would actually eat it, and tried to figure out how to explain what had happened. In the end, he didn't say anything. They ate dinner while Barrett talked about his day at school, something about a science project involving volcanoes. Callan listened and responded at the right moments, but his attention kept drifting to the note folded in his pocket and the woman who'd written it. After Barrett went to bed, Callan sat at the kitchen table with the note spread in front of him. Tell Barrett his uncle was a hero. The words seemed inadequate somehow, too simple for what they were trying to convey. But maybe that was the point. Maybe after everything complicated fell away, that was all that mattered. Nash had been a hero. Barrett deserved to know that. Callan's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it and felt his pulse jump. This is Sloane. I'm sorry I left. I wasn't ready. But I think I need to be. Can we talk tomorrow? He stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. Yes. Come by the garage whenever you're ready. The reply came almost immediately. Thank you. Callan set the phone down and looked at Nash's photo on the refrigerator, a different picture but the same man. Tomorrow he'd learn more about those final months, those final moments. Tomorrow Sloane would come back and maybe they'd both find something that helped. For now he sat in the quiet house and let himself feel the full weight of what the day had brought. Grief and hope tangled together. Questions answered and new ones raised, a connection to his brother's death that he'd never expected to find. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one, pushing back the darkness in small, measured increments. Sloane arrived at 8:30 the next morning, earlier than Callan had expected. He was replacing the serpentine belt on a Toyota when Jericho's distinctive panting announced their presence in the doorway between the garage and cafe. She wore the same canvas jacket, different jeans. Her hair was pulled back tighter today, severe enough to show the small scar above her left ear that yesterday's looser style had hidden. Callan straightened from under the hood, wiping his hands on a rag already black with accumulated grime. She stood in the threshold like she was bracing for impact, shoulders set in a way that suggested she'd spent the night preparing for this moment and still wasn't sure she could go through with it. Coffee's fresh. Help yourself. She nodded once and moved toward the counter with Jericho maintaining his position at her left side. Callan watched her pour a mug with hands steadier than yesterday, watched her add sugar and creamer in precise measurements. The red apron hung on its hook where he'd left it. She looked at it for several seconds before lifting it down and tying it around her waist. The morning rush started 15 minutes later. Construction workers first, then the early office crowd, then a cluster of retirees who came in every Thursday like clockwork. Sloane moved through it with surprising efficiency, pouring coffee and clearing tables with minimal wasted motion. She didn't chat with customers the way some people did, didn't offer commentary or ask about their days. Just took orders, filled them, collected payment. Professional distance maintained across every transaction. Callan finished the belt replacement and moved on to an alternator that had been making concerning sounds. He worked within earshot of the cafe, tracking Sloane's progress through the ambient noise. She handled the register without asking questions, made correct change, kept the counter wiped down. By 10 o'clock, when the rush thinned, she'd served maybe 30 people without a single mistake he'd noticed. She was refilling the sugar dispensers when he finally came over. Jericho lay beneath one of the tables, head resting on paws, but eyes open and tracking movement around the room. "You're good at this." Sloane glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the task. "It's not complicated. Most people still manage to screw it up. You didn't." She screwed the lid back onto a dispenser and set it on the counter with careful precision. "I follow instructions well. Military training." The opening was intentional, Callan recognized. An invitation to ask the question she knew he'd been holding since yesterday. He leaned against the counter and kept his voice low enough that the two remaining customers wouldn't overhear. "How long were you in 8 years total?" "4 active duty, 4 in the reserves before I went active again." That would put her somewhere in her early 30s, consistent with what he'd guessed. Young enough to have served with Nash during his final deployment, old enough to have accumulated the kind of specialized training that explained her current capabilities. "What was your role?" "Combat medic with tactical field coordination. I wasn't frontline infantry, but I was close enough to need the same training." The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture Callan didn't entirely like. Medics went where the casualties were. If she'd been with Nash's unit, she'd been in the worst of it. "Is that how you knew Nash medical support for his team?" Sloane's hand stilled on the sugar dispenser she'd been refilling. Her jaw worked for a moment before words came out. "I was embedded with his platoon for 6 months. Went on every mission. You don't get to stay back at base when you're the only person who can stop someone from bleeding out in the field." The casualness of the statement didn't match the weight it carried. Callan thought about Barrett safely at school, thought about the sanitized version of war he'd constructed in his head over the years. Sloane was describing something else entirely, a reality where 19-year-olds bled out in foreign dirt while people like her fought to keep them alive long enough for evacuation. What was he like, Nash, I mean, out there? She resumed filling the dispenser, but her movements had lost their earlier precision. He was careful, methodical. Some officers treat their people like chess pieces, acceptable losses, in pursuit of objectives. Nash wasn't like that. He knew everyone's name, knew who had kids back home, who was getting married, who'd just gotten a dog. He made it personal, which made it harder when things went wrong. Callan heard the shift in her voice, the way it hollowed out on those last words. He was careful. Past tense again, the language of the dead. "Did he talk about us, me and Barrett, all the time?" "He showed me pictures. Your son looked like him even as a baby." "Same eyes." Callan felt something clench in his chest. Nash had died when Barrett was too young for the boy to have any real memories. Everything Barrett knew about his uncle came from photos and stories, second-hand mythology built from fragments. The idea that Nash had carried pictures had talked about them enough that Sloane remembered Barrett's eyes 7 years later. The front door chimed. A woman in Postal Service uniform entered, someone Callan recognized from her weekly stops. Sloane moved to take her order without prompting, falling back into the professional efficiency she'd maintained all morning. Callan returned to the garage and tried to focus on the alternator, but his hands felt clumsy on the familiar tools. By noon, the cafe had emptied except for one elderly man nursing a coffee while working a crossword puzzle. Sloane had cleaned everything twice and was starting on inventory when Callan emerged from the garage bay. "You should take lunch. There's a diner 2 blocks down, or you can just take an hour off the clock." She shook her head. "I brought something. I'll eat in my car. You can eat here if you want. There's a table in back by the office." Sloane's hesitation was visible, a brief war between trained politeness and genuine preference. The polite response won. "That's okay. I need to check on Jericho anyway. Make sure he gets water." The dog looked perfectly content under his table, but Callan didn't argue. He watched her collect her jacket and head out the front door with Jericho at her side. Through the window he could see her cross to an older sedan parked at the far end of the lot, the kind of anonymous vehicle that blended into traffic without attracting attention. She didn't come back inside. Callan gave her 15 minutes, then 20. At 25 he started wondering if she'd left, entirely decided this whole arrangement was too complicated. At 30 minutes he saw her get out of the car and walk to the small patch of grass behind the building where Jericho could relieve himself. She returned at 12:45, exactly 1 hour after she'd left. The apron went back on without comment. She took up position behind the counter like she'd been there for months instead of hours. The afternoon brought its own rhythm, steadier than the morning chaos, but still requiring attention. Callan worked through his appointment list while keeping peripheral awareness of the cafe. Sloane handled each customer with the same professional distance, never warm, but never cold either. Functional. Efficient. At 2:15, her official end time, she untied the apron and hung it back on its hook. Callan was elbow-deep in an engine compartment, but extracted himself long enough to walk her to the door. "You coming back tomorrow if you still want me to?" "I do." "Same time." She nodded. then paused with her hand on the door. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you hire me? You didn't check references, didn't ask about my discharge status, didn't even ask why I limp. Most people won't hire someone with visible disabilities." Callan considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, tangled up in his own experiences with judgment and the way people had treated him after Lena died. The simplified version came easier. "You needed a job. I needed help. Everything else is just noise." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Thanks." She left with Jericho walking beside her, both of them moving with the same economical purpose. Callan watched through the window as she opened the car door and helped Jericho into the back seat. Her movements gentle, despite the prosthetic making certain angles awkward. Barrett came home from school full of questions about a science fair project that apparently required building something electrical. Callan made encouraging sounds while Barrett explained circuits and batteries, most of it flying over his head, but the enthusiasm infectious enough that he found himself genuinely interested. They were eating dinner when Barrett brought up the subject Callan had been avoiding. "When are we going to visit Uncle Nash?" Callan set down his fork and met his son's eyes across the table. "This weekend. Saturday morning. We can stop by the garden center after and pick up those flowers you wanted to plant." Barrett's face brightened. "Can we bring something for the grave? Like flowers or something? We can do that." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Callan's mind stayed stuck on the cemetery, on the granite headstone marking his brother's final resting place. On the fact that Sloan had been there when Nash died, had watched him bleed out while waiting for a helicopter that arrived too late. That night, after Barrett was asleep, Callan pulled out his laptop and did something he'd avoided for 7 years. He searched for information about the Kandahar operation that had killed Nash. The official reports were sparse, classified mostly, but there were fragments. News articles about a joint operation targeting high-value Taliban operatives. Casualty reports listing names without details. A few sanitized statements from military spokespeople about successful missions and regrettable losses. Nothing about a medic who'd survived. Nothing about delayed evacuations or triage decisions made under fire. The official story had been scrubbed clean of complexity, reduced to acceptable narrative. Callan closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen listening to the house settle around him. Tomorrow, Sloan would come back and they'd continue this strange dance circling around truths neither of them knew how to articulate. He should probably let it go, except that some questions didn't have answers. But Nash had been his brother, and this woman had been there at the end, and that connection felt too significant to ignore. Friday morning brought rain, the steady kind that settled in for hours. Sloan arrived at 8:30 again, jacket darkened with moisture, Jericho shaking water from his coat in the doorway. She tied on the apron and started the coffee without greeting, falling immediately into the established routine. The rain kept some customers away, but brought others seeking shelter. The cafe filled with damp bodies and steaming cups, conversations overlapping into white noise. Sloan navigated it all with the same efficiency, never rushed, but never slow. During a lull around 10, Callan brought over 2 mugs and sat across from her at the corner table. She was wiping down menus, her hands moving in small, repetitive circles that suggested muscle memory rather than thought. I looked up the Kandahar operation, the one where Nash died. Her hands stopped moving. She didn't look up. There's not much information available. Most of it's classified. That's intentional. Were there other casualties besides the 4 you mentioned? Sloan set down the menu and the rag. Her fingers laced together on the table knuckles, showing white. 6 killed in action total. Nash and 2 from his immediate team. 3 support personnel caught in secondary explosions when the compound collapsed. Callan absorbed the number. 6 families getting the same knock on their door he'd received. 6 sets of funeral arrangements and folded flags and condolence letters from officers who'd never met the deceased. How many wounded? 11, not counting me. Most were stable enough for standard medevac. I was the only critical case, so Nash stayed behind for you specifically, and the 2 others who couldn't move on their own. I was unconscious by then. I didn't know he'd stayed until weeks later when I woke up in Germany. Germany. That meant field hospital followed by transfer weeks of surgery and recovery before she'd been stable enough for the news. Callan tried to imagine it waking up with one leg gone and learning that your commanding officer had died trying to save you. Did anyone blame you? She finally looked up and the rawness in her eyes made Callan wish he hadn't asked. Everyone. The guys from Nash's team, the ones who survived. They didn't say it directly, but I could see it. Why did the medic make it when their lieutenant didn't? Why did she get priority when he was the one holding everything together? That's not fair. Fair doesn't matter in war. Results matter. Nash died. I lived. Those are the only facts that count. The door chimed as two customers entered, shaking rain from their jackets. Sloane stood immediately, the conversation terminated by necessity. Callan stayed at the table and watched her pour coffee, watched her maintain that careful professional distance that kept the world at arm's length. Barrett called at lunch to ask if he could go to a friend's house after school. Callan said yes and spent his own lunch hour replacing the water pump on a Subaru while rain drummed steadily on the garage roof. The work required concentration, left no space for thinking about war or death, or the woman in the next room carrying guilt that should have been distributed across a dozen shoulders. Sloane worked until 2:15, then hung up her apron and collected Jericho. She was halfway to the door when Callan called out, "Tomorrow I'm taking Barrett to the cemetery, to visit Nash's grave. You should come." She froze mid-step back to him, Jericho pressing against her legs in automatic support. When she turned around, her face had gone carefully blank. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I don't belong there. I'm not family. You were with him when he died. That counts for something." Sloane's hand found Jericho's head fingers digging into fur. Her voice came out tight and controlled. "What time? 9 o'clock. I can pick you up if you need a ride. I have a car. Then meet us there. Oakwood Cemetery North section." She nodded once and left without another word. Callan stood in the empty cafe and wondered if he'd just made a terrible mistake. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, yesterday's rain leaving everything crisp and bright. Callan dressed Barrett in clean jeans and the button-up shirt that only came out for special occasions. The boy didn't complain, seemed to understand that visiting Uncle Nash required a certain formality. They stopped at the florist on the way. Barrett picked out white lilies because he'd once heard Nash had liked them, though Callan couldn't remember his brother expressing an opinion about flowers one way or another. The bouquet was simple, tasteful, the kind of arrangement that wouldn't look out of place among the other tributes scattered across the cemetery. Oakwood sprawled across 15 acres of gently rolling hills, paths winding between sections marked by bronze plaques and stone benches. Nash's grave occupied a spot under an oak tree in the newer veterans section, where the headstones were all uniform granite markers that made the rows look like gray teeth embedded in green gums. Sloane's sedan was already there when they arrived, parked 3 spaces down from where Callan pulled in. She stood beside it with Jericho at her side, dressed in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made her look somehow smaller than she did in the bulky canvas jacket. Her prosthetic was more visible today, the blade foot showing below her pant leg. Barrett climbed out of the car, clutching the lilies. He spotted Sloane and Jericho, and his eyes went wide. "Dad, there's a dog." "That's Jericho. He was Uncle Nash's dog." The boy's face transformed with delight. Callan had mentioned working dogs before, shown him pictures of the military K-9 units Nash had sometimes worked with. But pictures were different from the living animal standing 20 feet away. "Can I pet him?" "You'll have to ask his owner." They approached together, Barrett half hiding behind Callan's leg despite his obvious interest. Sloane watched them come with an expression Callan couldn't decipher, something between apprehension and something softer. Barrett's voice came out small and polite. "Can I pet your dog?" Sloane glanced at Jericho, who sat perfectly still beside her. "He's friendly with kids. Just let him smell your hand first." Barrett extended one hand slowly, the lilies clutched against his chest with the other. Jericho leaned forward and sniffed, then licked the boy's fingers once before sitting back. Barrett's face split into a grin wide enough to show the gap where he'd lost a tooth last week. "He likes me." "He does. You can pet him if you're gentle." Barrett set the flowers carefully on the ground and used both hands to scratch behind Jericho's ears. The dog tolerated the attention with patient dignity, tail wagging in slow, measured beats. Callan watched his son interact with the animal that had been present at Nash's death and felt something complicated twist in his chest. Sloane's attention had shifted past them to the rows of headstones visible through the trees. Her jaw was tight, shoulders rigid beneath the sweater. "You okay?" "No. But I'm here. That's enough." They walked together toward Nash's grave. Barrett running ahead with Jericho bounding beside him, Sloane and Callan following at a slower pace that accommodated her prosthetic. The path curved gently upward, flanked by markers bearing names and dates that reduced entire lives to carved letters. Nash's stone was simple. Lieutenant Nash Royce, U.S. Navy SEAL, 1985 to 2019. Beloved brother and uncle. Someone, probably the cemetery staff, had cleared away the dead flowers from previous visits and straightened the small American flag planted beside the marker. Barrett knelt and placed the fresh lilies against the stone with solemn concentration. Callan stood behind him, one hand resting on his son's shoulder. Sloane had stopped several feet back, maintaining distance like she was afraid to get too close. Jericho had no such reservations. The dog moved forward on his own past Barrett right up to the headstone. He sniffed along its base, then lay down directly in front of it with his head resting on his paws. The position looked deliberate, chosen. A vigil. Callan felt his throat tighten. Beside him, Sloane made a sound that might have been a suppressed sob. Barrett looked back at them with wide eyes. Why is Jericho lying down? Callan searched for words that would make sense to a 9-year-old. Dogs remember people they love. Jericho loved Uncle Nash. He's saying goodbye. But Uncle Nash died a long time ago. Some goodbyes take longer than others. Barrett seemed to accept this. He settled beside Jericho and started telling the headstone about his science fair project, his voice carrying across the quiet morning. Callan moved to stand beside Sloane, close enough to see the tremor running through her hands. "First time back. First time at any military cemetery since my discharge." She paused, then added quieter, "First time seeing his name on stone instead of a casualty report. It gets easier. Eventually." "Does it?" The question was genuine, seeking actual information rather than rhetorical effect. Callan considered lying, offering the kind of empty comfort people usually deployed in situations like this. But Sloane deserved better. "No. It just gets different. The sharp edges dull down, but the shape stays the same." She nodded like this confirmed something she'd suspected. Her arms wrapped around herself despite the mild temperature, holding in whatever threatened to break loose. Barrett was explaining circuits to the headstone, his words tumbling over each other in enthusiastic detail. Jericho remained motionless, a furry guardian keeping watch. The scene would have been peaceful if not for the grief soaking into every part of it. Sloane finally stepped closer, moving to stand on the other side of the headstone from where Barrett sat. She looked down at Nash's name, traced the letters with her eyes without touching them. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I lived when you didn't. I'm sorry I ran away from your brother yesterday instead of staying to answer his questions." She paused, breath hitching. "I'm sorry for all of it." Barrett had stopped talking, looking between the adults with confusion creasing his forehead. Callan gave him a small shake of the head, a signal to stay quiet. The boy obeyed, returning his attention to Jericho. Sloane sank to her knees on the grass prosthetic leg extending awkwardly to the side. Her hands pressed flat against the earth in front of Nash's marker like she was trying to push something down or pull something up, Callan couldn't tell which. "The day you died, I made a promise. I promised myself I'd live well enough for both of us, accomplish enough for 2 people, make your sacrifice worth something." She laughed, the sound bitter and broken. "I've been failing at that for 7 years, working dead-end jobs, hiding from anything that might matter, drinking too much and sleeping too little. Some tribute. You're still here. That counts." Sloane's head snapped up, eyes meeting Callan's across the grave. "Does it? Because from where I'm standing, being here just means I'm taking up space. Nash should be occupying. He should be the one visiting his nephew, teaching him about circuits, being the Uncle Barrett deserves." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Callan felt them land in the space where his own guilt lived the part of him that wondered why Nash had been the one to die when Callan was the one with a family to protect a son who needed him. Barrett solved the problem by standing up and walking around the headstone to where Sloane knelt. He looked at her seriously, and when he spoke, his voice carried the blunt honesty only children could manage. "Uncle Nash died saving people. Dad told me. That means he thought saving people was more important than coming home. He wouldn't want you to be sad about being saved." Sloane stared at the boy like he'd just delivered a pronouncement from on high. Tears were running freely down her face now, unchecked and probably unnoticed. Barrett reached out and patted her shoulder the way he did when comforting classmates who'd fallen on the playground. "It's okay to be sad. But Dad says Uncle Nash would want us to be happy too. Both things can be true at the same time." The simplicity of the statement somehow made it more devastating. Callan watched Sloane's careful control finally fracture, watched her fold forward with sobs she'd probably been holding since Kandahar. Barrett kept his hand on her shoulder, patient and steady, while Jericho shifted closer to press against her other side. Callan knelt as well, completing the circle around Nash's grave. He rested one hand on Barrett's back and let the other hover near Sloane's shoulder before settling there. She didn't pull away, just let the grief roll through her in waves, while 3 living people and 1 dog kept vigil over the dead. Time moved strangely in that space. Could have been 5 minutes or 30. Eventually Sloane's sobs quieted to occasional hitching breaths. She wiped her face with her sleeves and sat back on her heels looking embarrassed. "Sorry. I didn't mean to fall apart like that." Barrett shook his head with the earnestness of youth. "Dad cries about Uncle Nash sometimes too. It's okay." Sloane's eyes found Callan's questioning. He shrugged, not bothering to deny it. Barrett had seen more than Callan sometimes gave him credit for. "Can I tell you something about your uncle? Something I think you should know?" Barrett nodded eagerly. Callan gestured for Sloane to continue. "The night he died, after I woke up in the hospital, one of his teammates came to see me. Guy named Rodriguez had a broken arm and burns on his legs, but insisted on making the trip from his ward to mine." She paused, gathering the memory. "He told me Nash had made a joke right before the end, asked Rodriguez if his fantasy football team was going to suck without him there to manage trades." Callan felt a smile tug at his mouth, despite everything. That sounded exactly like Nash finding humor in impossible circumstances. Rodriguez said he'd never forget it. Here's this man bleeding out, probably knowing he wasn't going to make it, and he's cracking jokes to keep everyone else's spirits up. Her voice softened. "Nash died the way he lived, thinking about other people first." Barrett absorbed this with the gravity it deserved. Was he scared? If he was, he didn't show it. I think he'd made peace with it by then. The boy seemed satisfied with this answer. He returned to Jericho and resumed his earlier position, leaning against the dog's warm bulk. Sloane used the headstone to lever herself upright, prosthetic clicking softly as it adjusted to her weight. Callan stood as well, brushing grass from his knees. "Thank you for coming. I almost didn't." She looked at the grave at Barrett and Jericho at Callan. "I'm glad I did, though. We come every few months. You're welcome to join us next time." Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor she'd been maintaining. "I'd like that." They stayed another 20 minutes, Barrett filling the silence with stories about school and friends, while Sloane and Callan stood on opposite sides of Nash's grave like bookends. Jericho eventually stood and shook himself, signaling readiness to move. The walk back to the cars felt different than the walk in had. Lighter somehow, despite the emotional weight they'd left at Nash's marker. Barrett chattered about wanting to get a dog of his own someday, specifically a German Shepherd like Jericho. Callan made non-committal sounds, knowing full well that conversation would resurface repeatedly until he either gave in or Barrett forgot about it. At the parking lot, Sloane opened her car door and then paused. "Do you have plans the rest of today?" "Nothing specific. Probably hit the garden center, then lunch somewhere." Barrett had been listening. "Can Sloane come?" The question hung in the air between them. Callan saw Sloane's instinct to refuse, watched her wrestle with it, saw the moment she made a different choice. "If you don't mind the company, We don't mind. The garden center was a sprawling maze of greenhouses and outdoor displays. Barrett dragged them through sections devoted to vegetables, herbs, and flowering plants, his enthusiasm undimmed despite not knowing what half of them were called. Sloane followed with Jericho, commenting occasionally on which plants were toxic to dogs and which were safe. They ended up buying a flat of marigolds because Barrett liked the colors and Callan liked that they were hard to kill. Also 3 tomato plants that would probably die within a month but seemed like a good learning opportunity. Lunch happened at a family diner that allowed dogs on the patio. Barrett ordered a burger the size of his head and managed to eat half before declaring himself full. Sloane picked at a salad, more interested in giving Jericho water than consuming calories herself. Halfway through the meal, Barrett asked the question that had probably been building all morning. "How did you meet Uncle Nash?" Sloane set down her fork and glanced at Callan. He nodded permission to answer however she felt comfortable. "I was a medic, a person who helps injured soldiers. I worked with your uncle's team overseas. Did you save people? I tried to. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Uncle Nash was a hero." "Did you save him?" The question landed like a punch. Sloane's face went carefully blank, that professional mask sliding into place. Callan was about to intervene when she spoke, her voice steady despite what the answer must cost. "No, I wasn't able to save him. But he saved other people before he died. That's what mattered to him." Barrett considered this while working on a French fry. "So you're a hero too then? Because you tried." The simplicity of the child's logic seemed to catch Sloane off guard. She blinked rapidly, then nodded once. "I appreciate you saying that." The conversation drifted to safer topics after that. School projects and favorite foods and whether Jericho preferred swimming or running. Normal things, the kind of lunch conversation that happened at 1,000 tables across the country every day. Driving home afterward, Barrett fell asleep in the back seat with dirt under his fingernails from handling the plants. Callan glanced in the rearview mirror at his son's slack face, so peaceful in unconsciousness. Sloane's car followed them back to the house, pulling into the driveway behind Callan's truck. She helped carry the plants around back while Barrett continued sleeping. They worked in comfortable silence, setting the marigolds and tomatoes in spots that got enough sun but not too much. When they finished, Sloane stood in the middle of the backyard with Jericho sitting at her feet and looked around like she was cataloging everything. The uncut grass, the fence that needed painting, the old swing set Callan kept meaning to take down but couldn't quite bring himself to dismantle. "You have a good life here. Nash would be happy his nephew is growing up somewhere like this." Callan wiped soil from his hands onto his jeans. "We do okay. Better than okay." She paused, then added quieter. "Thank you for letting me be part of today. I needed it more than I knew." "You're welcome to come back. Barrett clearly likes you." "Just Barrett." The question caught him off guard with its directness. Callan met her eyes and found himself answering with the same honesty. "No, not just Barrett." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Sloane smiled, small but genuine, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "I should go. Let you get your afternoon back." "See you Monday morning." "Yeah, Monday morning." She loaded Jericho into her car and pulled away with a final wave. Callan stood in the driveway and watched until her taillights disappeared around the corner, then went inside to wake Barrett and start the evening routine. That night, after Barrett was asleep, Callan sat in the kitchen with a beer he didn't particularly want and thought about the day. About Sloane kneeling at Nash's grave, finally releasing grief she'd carried since Kandahar. About Barrett's simple wisdom that both sadness and happiness could exist simultaneously. About the way Jericho had lain down in front of the headstone like he'd been waiting 7 years for permission to say goodbye. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number he now recognized as Sloane's. The message was short. "Thank you for today. For all of it. I think Nash would have liked knowing we met." Callan typed back without overthinking it. "He would have. Sleep well." The response came quickly. "You too." He finished his beer and rinsed the bottle, set it in the recycling bin Barrett had decorated with marker drawings of environmental slogans. The house settled around him in its familiar nighttime rhythms. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Closer, the refrigerator cycled on. Tomorrow was Sunday. He'd promised Barrett they could work on the science fair project. Maybe they'd swing by the hardware store for supplies, grab ice cream after. Regular weekend things that made up the substance of regular lives. But Monday would come, and with it Sloane arriving at 8:30 to tie on the red apron and pour coffee for people who had no idea what she'd survived. And maybe that was enough. Maybe showing up and doing the work and slowly finding ways to exist alongside your grief, maybe that was all any of them could manage. Callan turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to bed. Through Barrett's open door he could hear his son's steady breathing, safe and oblivious to the complicated dance of trauma and healing happening in the adult world around him. Some things stayed broken. Some things slowly knit themselves back together. And some things, like the connection between a dead man's brother and the medic who'd tried to save him, created new patterns entirely. Monday morning brought fog thick enough to obscure the street beyond the garage windows. Sloane arrived 10 minutes early, materializing out of the gray with Jericho at her side, like something conjured from the mist itself. The red apron went on without hesitation. She'd brought her own travel mug this time, filled it from the pot, and started wiping down tables that were already clean. Callan watched from the garage bay where he was checking fluid levels on a minivan scheduled for a transmission flush. Something had shifted over the weekend, some invisible barrier that had stood between professional courtesy and actual connection. Sloane moved through the cafe space differently now, less like she was preparing for an ambush, and more like she actually belonged there. The morning rush unfolded in its usual chaos. Sloane handled it with increasing confidence, anticipating orders from regulars before they spoke, remembering how people took their coffee without needing to ask twice. The construction workers who'd made her uncomfortable that first day now greeted her by name. She didn't offer much conversation in return, but she nodded acknowledgement, and that seemed sufficient. During a lull around 10, one of the regulars, an older veteran named Frank, who came in 3 times a week, struck up a conversation with Sloane while she refilled his mug. Callan couldn't hear the specifics from where he worked, but he saw Frank gesture toward Jericho's service vest, saw Sloane's shoulders tense before she gave some minimal response. Frank pulled up his sleeve to show a tattoo, faded blues and greens that had probably been vivid decades ago. Marine insignia EGA, clearly visible even from a distance. Sloane's posture changed immediately, relaxing into the shared language of military service. They talked for maybe 5 minutes, Frank doing most of it, while Sloane listened with an attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. When Frank finally left, he clapped Sloane gently on the shoulder in passing. She didn't flinch away. Callan wiped his hands and walked over. What was that about Sloane was arranging pastries in the display case even though they were already perfectly arranged. He wanted to know where I served. What branch? You tell him. Enough. Navy Afghanistan medical discharge. He filled in the rest himself based on Jericho. Frank's good people. Lost his son in Iraq back in '07. I figured it was something like that. The way he looked at me like he understood things he'd rather not. That's most of the vets who come through here. They recognize their own. Sloane closed the display case and turned to face him directly. Is that why you hired me? Because I'm one of them. I hired you because you needed work and showed up on time. Everything else is just context. She studied his face like she was checking for lies, then seemed satisfied with whatever she found. Good. Because I don't want to be anyone's charity case. You're not. You've been pulling your weight since day one. The front door chimed, cutting off whatever response she'd been forming. An elderly woman entered, supporting herself with a walker, moving with the careful deliberation of someone for whom falling meant broken bones. Sloane moved to help immediately, holding the door while the woman maneuvered through, guiding her to the nearest table. Tuesday brought rain again, steady drumming on the metal roof that turned the garage into an echo chamber. Barrett called during lunch, asking if he could stay late at school for science club. Callan said yes, and used the extra time to tackle a brake job that had been sitting on the schedule for 3 days. Sloane worked through the afternoon shift even though her official hours ended at 2. She didn't ask permission, just kept the coffee fresh and the tables clean while Callan wrestled with seized brake calipers. Around 4, when the last customer had left and rain showed no signs of stopping, she finally untied her apron. "I've been thinking about something." Callan emerged from under the car he'd been working on, wiping grease from his forearms. "Yeah, that sign you have out front. Royce's Garage and Cafe. The cafe part is kind of an afterthought, isn't it? 4 tables and a coffee pot. That's all it's ever been. Dad added it years ago because people got bored waiting for their cars. It could be more, though, if you wanted." Callan straightened fully, giving her his complete attention. "What did you have in mind?" Sloane pulled out her phone and showed him notes she'd apparently been compiling. Ideas listed in neat columns, each one annotated with costs and logistics. Expand the seating. Add 6 more tables, maybe some booths. Upgrade the coffee maker to something commercial grade. Bring in a baker to supply fresh pastries instead of the pre-packaged stuff. Create a space where veterans could gather without it being officially a veteran thing, just somewhere that felt safe. The specificity suggested she'd been thinking about this for more than a few hours. Callan scrolled through her notes, impressed by the level of detail. "This would require investment. Money. I'm not sure I have right now." "I know, but I've been looking at the numbers from last week. You're already pulling decent revenue from coffee sales alone. With some marketing and better product, you could double that easily." "You've been looking at the revenue numbers." Sloane had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "The register system isn't exactly secure. I wasn't snooping, just noticed patterns while running end-of-day reports." Callan should probably have been annoyed by the invasion of privacy, but mostly he was curious. "Why do you care? This isn't your business. Not yet. But it could be." The words hung between them, weighted with implications Callan wasn't sure how to parse. Sloane seemed to realize she'd said more than intended because she quickly added, "I mean, as an employee. Someone with investment in seeing the place succeed. You've been here less than a week." "Yeah, and I've worked 10 different jobs in the last 3 years. Fast food, retail, warehouse work, all of it temporary because I couldn't handle the noise or the people or my own head." She gestured around the cafe. "This is the first place that hasn't felt like drowning." The honesty in the statement made Callan's chest tight. He looked at her notes again, really considering them, instead of dismissing them outright. The ideas were good, practical. The kind of expansion that could transform the garage from a break-even operation into something genuinely profitable. "Let me think about it. Run some actual numbers, see what's feasible." Sloane nodded, relief visible in the loosening of her shoulders. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." That night, after Barrett was asleep, Callan pulled out Sloane's notes and his own financial records. Running actual numbers turned out to be depressing. The garage operated in the black, but barely. Most months he cleared enough to cover mortgage, utilities, Barrett's expenses, and not much else. He was about to close the laptop when an idea occurred to him. Nash had left money. Not a fortune, but a decent amount from his military life insurance. Callan had put it in a trust for Barrett, untouched since the lawyers had finished the paperwork 7 years ago. The original plan had been college fund, something to give his son options when the time came. But Barrett was 9. College was almost a decade away. And if the garage expanded successfully, if it became the kind of business that could actually support them long-term instead of just keeping them afloat, that seemed like an investment Nash would approve of. Callan made notes of his own calculations about how much could be borrowed from the trust without crippling Barrett's future options. The numbers worked if he was careful. Tight, but workable. Thursday morning he showed Sloane his math. She reviewed it at the corner table during a slow period, Jericho's head resting on her knee, while she scrolled through his spreadsheet. This could work. You'd need to be disciplined about reinvesting profits for the first year, but the projections are solid. Those projections are based on your estimates about increased revenue. What if you're wrong? Then we're in the same place we started, just with better coffee equipment. She looked up from the screen. But I'm not wrong. I've been watching patterns all week. The people who come in here want somewhere to belong. Give them that and they'll keep coming back. Callan wanted to believe her. The alternative was continuing to scrape by month after month, always one major repair away from financial disaster. That wasn't sustainable, especially with Barrett getting older and more expensive every year. "Okay, let's do it." Sloane blinked. "Just like that. Just like that. But I need help planning it out." choosing equipment, designing the expansion, all of it. I'm a mechanic, not a business consultant. I can do that." She paused, then added more quietly, "I want to do that." They shook on it across the table, her grip firm despite the slight tremor that still sometimes appeared in her hands. Jericho's tail thumped against the floor like he was approving the deal. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of planning and logistics. Construction started on a Monday, contractors arriving at 6 a.m. with equipment and attitudes. The garage side stayed operational, but the cafe had to close for renovations. Sloan showed up every day anyway, walking through the construction zone with Jericho, making notes and occasionally redirecting workers who weren't following the plans exactly. On Thursday of construction week, Callan found her sitting on the floor of what would become the expanded seating area, back against a wall that had been torn down to studs and rebuilt. Jericho lay beside her, head in her lap. She was staring at nothing, face drawn in a way that suggested she wasn't seeing the construction zone around her. "You okay?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice came out flat and distant. "It's been 7 years today, since Kandahar." Callan lowered himself to sit beside her, careful not to crowd her space. The anniversary of Nash's death wasn't until September, but Sloane's timeline was different. She'd been wounded that day, had watched people die. The calendar marked it differently for her. "What do you usually do?" "On this day?" "Nothing. Drink too much. Sleep too little. Avoid anything that might make me feel human." She looked at him sideways. "This year I'm sitting in a construction zone planning a business expansion. It's weird. Better than the alternative, though. Maybe." She was quiet for a moment. "Then I went to see Nash's grave yesterday. Took Jericho and just sat there for a while. I told him about the cafe plans, about working here, about Barrett teaching me that sadness and happiness can exist together. What do you think he would have said? Probably would have made some joke about me finally finding gainful employment. Then he'd have asked if you were paying me enough." Callan smiled despite the heaviness of the moment. "Sounds like him." Sloane's hand found his on the dusty floor, fingers interlacing briefly before she pulled back. "Thank you for giving me this. A place where I can actually function instead of just surviving." "You're not just surviving anymore. You know that, right?" Her throat worked as she swallowed. "I'm starting to." The cafe reopened 3 weeks after construction started, transformed into something that barely resembled its original incarnation. 12 tables instead of 4, booth seating along one wall, a proper commercial espresso machine that had cost more than Callan wanted to think about. The walls were Barrett's chosen blue-gray, decorated with framed photographs of the garage's history. Callan's father standing beside the original sign, Nash in uniform during one of his leaves home, even a recent shot of Sloane behind the counter with Jericho at her feet. The reopening happened on a Saturday. By 8 a.m. the place was packed, regulars claiming their preferred spots, and new faces drawn in by the fresh paint and the sandwich board signs Sloane had placed on the sidewalk. Frank the Marine showed up with 3 friends, all veterans from various eras and conflicts. They occupied a booth and stayed for 3 hours drinking coffee and swapping stories. By the time they left, they'd scheduled a weekly meetup for the same spot every Saturday. Barrett helped during the rush, bussing tables and refilling water glasses with the serious concentration of someone who'd been given real responsibility. Sloane worked the espresso machine with efficiency that suggested weeks of practice instead of days. She'd convinced Callan to hire a part-timer for weekends, a college student named Maya, who was cheerful enough to balance Sloane's more reserved demeanor. By noon, they'd served more customers than the old cafe typically saw in a week. By 4, when they finally flipped the sign to closed, all 3 of them were exhausted and exhilarated. Barrett collapsed into a booth with Jericho, both of them looking equally worn out. Maya counted tips with enthusiasm. Sloane stood behind the counter, surveying the space with an expression Callan had learned to recognize as satisfaction mixed with disbelief. "We did it." She looked at him, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "We really did." The first month passed in controlled chaos. The veteran community that Frank had brought in grew organically, word spreading through networks Callan didn't have access to. People started coming not just for coffee, but for the atmosphere, the sense that this was a place that understood certain things without requiring explanation. Barrett's 9th birthday arrived in late October. He wanted the party at the cafe, wanted Sloane to help. She said yes without hesitation, coordinating with Maya to handle regular customers, while one section got reserved for birthday festivities. The party itself was exactly what a 9-year-old's birthday should be. Loud, chaotic, full of sugar-fueled energy that eventually crashed into exhaustion. Toward the end, after most guests had been picked up, Barrett presented Sloane with one of his hand-drawn invitations. "This is for you, because you're part of the family now." Sloane took the card with hands that trembled slightly. She looked at the drawing herself, and Jericho rendered in crayon with earnest imperfection. "Thank you, Barrett. I'll keep this forever." After he ran off, she stood holding the card like it was made of spun glass eyes, bright with unshed tears. Callan moved to stand beside her. "You okay?" "Yeah. Just processing the fact that a 9-year-old understands family better than most adults I know. He's got good instincts. He gets that from his father." The comment landed with unexpected weight. Callan met her eyes and found something there he hadn't quite let himself acknowledge before. Attraction, yes, but also deeper recognition. "Sloane. Don't. Not yet." She set the card down carefully. "I need to figure out how to be okay with myself before I can be okay with anything else." "I can wait. I know. That's what makes this harder." November brought early snow and holidays looming. Thanksgiving week, Callan invited Sloane to join them for dinner. She accepted with careful gratitude that suggested she'd been hoping for the invitation but hadn't wanted to assume. The meal itself was nothing fancy, but Barrett insisted on setting the table properly, and Sloane brought wine that was probably too nice for the occasion, and something about the whole thing felt right in a way that made Callan's chest ache. After Barrett went to bed, Sloane helped clean up. They worked in comfortable silence, washing and drying dishes while Jericho dozed in the corner. When the last plate was put away, Sloane leaned against the counter and looked at Callan with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "I've been thinking about what you said. About waiting." "Okay. I don't think I need you to wait anymore. I think I'm as okay as I'm going to get, and that's probably good enough." Callan set down the dish towel he'd been holding. "You sure know, but I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions." He crossed the kitchen to stand in front of her, close enough to see the faint scar on her jawline, the gray flecks in her eyes that caught the overhead light. Close enough to reach out and cup her face in his hands if he wanted to. He wanted to. Sloane leaned into the touch eyes, closing briefly. When they opened again, something had shifted. Permission-granted walls lowered. Callan kissed her softly, giving her space to pull back if she needed it. She didn't pull back. She leaned in closer, hands finding his waist, the kiss deepening into something that spoke of loneliness, finally finding its answer. They broke apart slowly, foreheads resting together while they caught their breath. Jericho had woken and was watching them with what Callan could have sworn was approval. "Well." Sloane laughed, the sound lighter than he'd ever heard from her. "Yeah. Well, what happens now? Now we figure it out as we go, same as everything else." December arrived with more snow and holiday decorations appearing throughout the cafe. Barrett noticed the shift between Callan and Sloane, immediately possessing the uncanny observational skills of children who paid more attention than adults gave them credit for. He didn't comment directly, just started referring to Sloane as part of their plans with increasing frequency. On Christmas Eve, the cafe closed early. Callan invited Sloane to stay, and she accepted with the understanding that this was crossing another threshold. Barrett opened presents with the two of them, watching Jericho wearing a bow-tie collar that Sloane had bought as a joke, but actually looked distinguished. Among the gifts was one from Sloane to Callan, a small box that he opened with more trepidation than warranted by its size. Inside was Nash's sealed trident pin, the one that had been with his personal effects. "I went to his parents. Asked if they'd be willing to pass it on to you." Sloane's voice was quiet, careful. "They said Nash would want his brother to have it. That you'd earned it by raising Barrett and keeping his memory alive." Callan's hands shook as he held the pin metal still bright despite the years. The weight of it was negligible, but the significance was crushing in the best way possible. "Thank you. This means I don't even have words for what this means. Sloane reached over and squeezed his hand. You don't need words. I know. Barrett had been watching the exchange with curiosity. Can I see? Callan handed over the pin and watched his son examine it with the reverence of someone who understood this was important, even if the specifics escaped him. This was Uncle Nash's. It was. And now it's ours. All of ours. The boy carefully handed it back to Callan, who pinned it to his shirt pocket. The metal caught the Christmas lights, throwing small reflections across the walls. That night, after Barrett was asleep, Sloane and Callan sat on the couch with Jericho sprawled across their feet. The house was quiet except for the furnace cycling and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals through the streetlight beams. I never thought I'd have this. Sloane's words were barely audible. A place to belong. People who didn't see me as broken. You're not broken. You're just carrying weight most people can't see. Same thing sometimes. No. Broken means can't function. You function just fine. You just do it differently. She shifted closer, head resting on his shoulder. 7 years I spent running from anything that mattered. And then a dog recognized a scent, and everything changed. Sometimes that's all it takes. One moment, one connection. Everything pivots. Do you think Nash knew? When he was dying, do you think he knew that we'd end up here? I don't know. Maybe. He always said things work out the way they're supposed to, even when it doesn't feel like it. Sloane was quiet for a long moment. I used to hate that kind of thinking. Felt like an excuse for terrible things happening. But sitting here now, I think I'm starting to understand it. What changed you? Barrett. This whole improbable thing we've built. She lifted her head to look at him. Nash died saving people. I lived because someone saved me. And now we're here making something that honors both of those truths. It's not neat or fair, but it's real. Callan kissed her forehead, tasting salt from tears he hadn't realized she was crying. Real is enough. New Year's came with the cafe hosting a small party invitation only for regulars who'd become friends. Frank brought his veteran crew. Maya invited her boyfriend. Even the contractors who'd done the renovation stopped by to see the finished product in action. At midnight, Callan stood behind the counter with Sloane beside him and Barrett between them, watching their community celebrate together. Jericho sat at attention, scanning the room with the calm vigilance that never quite left him, even in safe spaces. The clock struck 12. People cheered and hugged and made noise that should have been overwhelming but somehow felt right. Sloane's hand found Callan's fingers interlacing with familiar ease. Barrett looked up at both of them with a grin that spoke of happiness too large for his 9-year-old body to contain. This is the best New Year's ever. Callan met Sloane's eyes over his son's head. Yeah, buddy. I think you might be right. Later, after everyone had gone home and the cleanup was done, Sloane stood in the empty cafe with Jericho and surveyed the space they'd created together. Callan watched her from the doorway, seeing what she saw. A place where broken people could come to remember they were whole, where service and sacrifice were understood without explanation, where coffee and conversation created community from strangers. She turned and caught him watching. What? Just thinking about how far we've come. 6 months ago, this was barely breaking even. Now look at it. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in my car and drinking too much. Now I have an apartment and a job, and she gestured between them, whatever this is. This is family. That's what Barrett called it, and I think he nailed it. Sloane's smile was soft, genuine, the kind she only showed when defenses were completely down. Family. Yeah, I can work with that. They locked up together and walked out into January cold that felt clean and sharp. Sloane's car was parked beside Callan's truck, both vehicles covered in a fresh dusting of snow that would need to be brushed off before driving. She paused before getting in, looking back at the cafe where light still glowed through the windows. Thank you for taking a chance on me, for seeing past the limp and the dog and all the complications. Thank you for staying, for not running when things got hard. The kiss started cold, ended warm. I'm done running. This is where I belong. Callan watched her drive away, taillights disappearing around the corner toward the apartment she'd finally rented. Jericho's silhouette was visible in the back seat, keeping watch even in transit. He drove home through streets empty of traffic, the city quiet in the post-midnight lull. Barrett was sleeping over at a friend's house, which meant the house would be empty when he arrived, but empty didn't feel lonely anymore. It just felt like the pause between one good thing and the next. Inside, he set the sealed trident pin on the mantel beside Lena's photo and Nash's memorial portrait. 3 different kinds of love, 3 different kinds of loss, all of them woven together into the fabric of who he'd become. His phone buzzed. Sloane's text was brief but carried weight. "Home safe. See you tomorrow. Love you." Callan stared at those last 2 words the first time either of them had said it explicitly. His fingers moved across the screen without conscious thought. "Love you too. Sleep well." He climbed the stairs to bed, bone-tired but content in a way he hadn't been since before Lena died. Outside, the street lights pushed back the darkness in small, measured increments. Inside, the house settled into its familiar rhythms. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, in the space between the old year and the new, everything was exactly as it should be. The broken pieces had found each other, and in finding each other they'd discovered they were never truly broken at all, just waiting for the right moment to become whole.